The day I found her, it wasn't dramatic, no music, no slow-motion moment, just a woman with wet shoes and a paper bag of groceries spotting a shivering dog huddled beneath a busted recycling bin on Sycamore and 8th. She wasn't barking. Not even whining, just curled into herself, rain-soaked and looking more like a pile of leaves than a living thing. But when I bent down to get a closer look, I saw her belly, round, taut, moving with small tremors underneath the skin, and my brain clicked into a kind of survival autopilot. I dropped the bag, crouched low, and said, "Hey girl," in the softest voice I could manage, even though I had no idea what I was doing. "I don't rescue animals, I don't even own any. And the only thing I know about dogs I picked up from scrolling cute videos at 1 a.m., but there was something about her eyes. They weren't wild or afraid, just tired, like she'd waited long enough for someone to notice. I took off my coat, wrapped it around her carefully, and carried her the 3 blocks home, muttering things like, you're okay, even though neither of us were. My apartment is a modest 1-bedroom above a bookstore, small kitchen, weird creaky radiator, more books than furniture, and definitely not equipped for a birthing suite. But I laid her on a blanket in the corner near the heater and called the nearest vet, who didn't immediately send me to voicemail. They said to keep her warm, feed her soft food, and get ready. Because labor looked close, I made a nest of towels, scrambled some eggs, and stayed up most of the night just watching her sleep, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. In the morning, I named her Maple, because her fur had this reddish gold hue under the lamp, like autumn leaves dipped in honey. And 5 days later, at 4:12 a.m., she nudged me awake with her nose and gave a single, low whine. I didn't know much, but I knew enough to understand what that meant. It was time. Labor came in waves, and Maple handled it with a quiet strength that made me feel both deeply unprepared and oddly honored to witness it. I sat beside her for hours, wiping her head with a damp cloth, murmuring the kind of nonsense I imagine mothers might whisper to soothe a scared child, though I think it was more for me than her. The first puppy arrived quickly, slick and squealing, and Maple licked it clean with careful determination before nudging it toward her belly. Then came the second, and the third, each one a tiny miracle wrapped in wet fur and trembling limbs. Each time I cried just a little quietly, hoping not to distract her from whatever ancient instinct was guiding her through this. By the 6th, I was emotionally and physically wrecked. Sitting cross-legged on the floor in a sweatshirt I'd spilled tea on hours ago, hands stained with warm towels and the weight of something bigger than I could name. But Maple was far from done. I counted 7 puppies by sunrise, all nestled against her like living commas, breathing and squirming and impossibly new. I started cleaning up the used towels, swapping out the soaked ones, when I noticed something on the smallest pup, the one curled farthest from the others, half hidden under Maple's tail. It wasn't a collar or a scrap of fur. It was a thin, red thread, braided delicately and tied around its tiny neck in a loose loop, not tight enough to harm, but unmistakably intentional. I froze. My mind went straight to panic. Did I leave yarn on the floor? Did it get caught on something? But the braid was too precise, too clean. I carefully untied it, heart racing, and laid it flat in my hand. It was no more than 6 inches long, crimson and worn, as if it had been handled often. I sat there for several minutes just staring at it, unsure if I was imagining the implications. Then I took a photo and did what any confused millennial would do at 6:45 a.m. I Googled it. The search returned hundreds of hits, from cultural traditions to urban myths, all tied to the same idea. Red thread used in newborn rituals, symbols of fate, protection, destiny. But every article had the same glaring truth. None of them mentioned animals. The red thread was for humans. I sat there, the early light creeping through my blinds, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor as I held this tiny braided thread between my fingers, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. It couldn't be. Who would tie something like that around a newborn puppy's neck? Not by accident, not in the chaos of birth, not without purpose. I looked back at the pup. It was the runt, smaller than the others, with soft gray fur that looked almost blue in certain light. And while the rest of the litter squirmed and cried for warmth and milk, this one lay still, eyes closed, breathing steady but shallow, like it wasn't quite ready to be here. I tucked it gently beside Maple, who licked its head once and sighed like she already knew this puppy would need more watching than the others. I didn't say anything about the thread when I brought them to the vet later that afternoon. I told myself it would sound paranoid, that maybe there was an explanation I just hadn't thought of yet. The vet gave Maple a clean bill of health, confirmed all 7 pups were alive and well, and told me I had a beautiful little miracle on my hands. I smiled, nodded, and carried them home in a crate that felt heavier than before, not because of the weight, but because of the questions. piling up in my mind like unread books. Later that night, when the house was still and the only sound was the soft hum of the fridge, I pulled out the red thread again and studied it under the lamp. It wasn't just braided. It was intricate, with 3 different fibers twisted together, one of which shimmered faintly like silk. I Googled again, deeper this time, and stumbled on a forum buried in the internet's forgotten corners, where people shared stories of marked animals, births that shouldn't have happened, symbols that didn't belong, animals born with omens on their bodies. Most were wild tales, clearly fiction, but one post stuck with me. If you ever find a red-threaded newborn, it means someone hid it. Someone wanted it protected or kept from being found. I stared at the screen, heart thudding, and whispered out loud without meaning to, "Who were you hiding from, Maple?" And at that exact moment, she lifted her head from sleep and looked at me. Not like a dog, like she'd heard me. Her eyes were calm, unblinking, and so full of something human it made my skin prickle. It wasn't surprise or fear. It was more like recognition, like she'd been waiting for me to ask the question out loud. She laid her head back down without a sound, but something in the air had shifted, like the room had decided to listen in. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid of Maple, but because the thread was still in my hand, and I couldn't shake the weight of it. By morning, I'd convinced myself again that I was overthinking, that I'd found an odd little artifact and let my imagination run wild. But that logic cracked fast when I got a message from an unknown number. It came through at 7:03 a.m. and simply read, "Is the last one alive?" No name, no greeting, just that sentence, sitting on my screen like a cold breath. I dropped the phone, heart pounding, and snatched it back up to screenshot the message before it disappeared. But there was nothing to screenshot. The message was gone. I checked my logs, my deleted messages, even went through my app notifications. Nothing, like I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I held the smallest pup, wrapped in a washcloth, and just stared at him for a long time. He didn't open his eyes, didn't squirm like the others, but his chest moved in that same slow, even rhythm, like a drumbeat I was starting to feel in my bones. I named him Ash, short for Ashen, not because of his color, but because of the way he felt, like something burned down just to make room for him to exist. I told myself again not to panic, but then the next weird thing happened. My front door was cracked open when I got out of the shower. I always lock it. Always. And now it was open by 2 inches, no wind, no draft, no guests. Maple was sitting in front of it, body tense, tail low, eyes locked on the hallway beyond like she expected someone to be standing there. She didn't bark. She just waited. I called the building manager, asked if anyone had accessed my unit, and he said the cameras on my floor had been out for 2 days, just a glitch. Funny timing, I said, and he laughed like it was a joke, but it wasn't funny. I changed the locks that night. The locksmith came that afternoon, a guy named Henry who smelled faintly of WD-40 and fast food. And while he drilled out the old deadbolt, I asked him, casually, but not really, if anyone had recently changed locks in the building, maybe someone else on my floor. He shook his head, said I was the first call in weeks, and then glanced down at Maple, who sat beside me like a statue, watching him work. "Beautiful girl," he said, reaching to scratch her ear, but she pulled away fast, teeth barely showing, a low growl rolling in her throat like thunder under gravel. "Sorry," he muttered, backing off. "Some dogs just know things." I didn't ask him what he meant, but the sentence stayed with me long after he left. That night, I couldn't stop staring at the red thread. It was now tucked in a small glass jar on my desk, like a relic, like a fuse waiting for someone to strike a match. The other 6 puppies were thriving, nursing, crawling, yipping in soft, sleepy bundles. But Ash remained apart. Not rejected, not sick, just separate, as though he understood, even at a week old, that he wasn't quite like the rest. And then something new happened. I started dreaming of him. Vivid, unsettling dreams where he was walking, not crawling, across the floor toward the jar, his tiny head tilting as he looked up at me and said, in a voice too low and slow to be human or canine, "You can't keep me." I'd wake in cold sweats, breathless, and every time I checked the jar first, half expecting it to be empty, but it never was. And then I got a letter, not a text, not an email, an actual letter, tucked under my door in a plain envelope. No stamp, no return address. The paper inside was crisp, typewritten, and read, "There are things that look like dogs, but are not dogs. If you have the thread, we know where he is. You have 6 days." That was it. I read it 4 times, checked the hallway. Empty. And then sat on the floor beside Maple, who stared at me with her steady, unreadable gaze. I whispered, "Is this what you were running from?" And her ears twitched, but she didn't move. Ash, meanwhile, opened his eyes for the first time, not cloudy and blue like a newborn's, but dark, focused, and already knowing. The moment his eyes met mine, the air changed, like a pressure drop before a storm, subtle but undeniable. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared into those impossibly steady eyes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Newborn puppies don't open their eyes for at least 10 days, and even then, their vision is blurry, unformed. But Ash didn't blink, didn't waver. He looked directly at me like he knew me, like he was waiting to see what I'd do next. I reached out slowly, half expecting him to recoil, but he didn't. Instead, he lifted his tiny paw and placed it on my finger, like a handshake or a claim. I jerked my hand back, heart racing, because something about that touch felt intentional. Over the next few days, I became obsessed, watching him more than the others, searching for explanations, stories, anything that could make sense of the letter and the dreams and the thread. Every night, I moved the jar to a new hiding place, and every morning I'd find it back on my desk, untouched, exactly centered, like someone, or something, was reminding me I wasn't in control. The letter hadn't lied. On the third day, I noticed someone across the street, standing under a street lamp long after the rest of the neighborhood had gone to sleep. A tall figure in a dark coat, not moving, just staring at my window. I turned off the lights and watched, heart thudding, and after what felt like an hour, they finally turned and disappeared down the sidewalk without a word. I reported it to the police, of course. They said they'd send a car around, but no one ever came. And then there was Maple. She'd changed too. More alert, more restless, and fiercely protective of Ash, keeping the other puppies at a distance, even from me. She'd begun standing at the door each night, tail low, head tilted like she was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. I didn't sleep. I started locking my bedroom door from the inside, because part of me, the part one didn't want to admit was growing louder, didn't trust that whatever I'd brought into my home hadn't brought something else in with it. And on the 6th night, I woke to the soft scrape of claws on the hardwood, inside my room. Ash, sitting at the foot of my bed, eyes wide open, thread back around his neck. I couldn't move. I wanted to. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to sit up, flip on the light, grab something heavy, but I couldn't. I just stared at him, that tiny gray body with those unnatural eyes and that red thread glinting faintly in the sliver of moonlight slicing through the curtains. He didn't blink, didn't shiver like puppies usually do, just stared right back at me. And then, God help me, he tilted his head and let out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, but something in between, like a language that never quite made it into human mouths. It only lasted a second, but it vibrated in my bones like feedback through an old speaker. I finally moved, flipped on the lamp with a shaky hand, blinked in the sudden light, and he was gone. Not under the bed, not in the hallway, just gone. I found him an hour later, curled beside Maple like nothing had happened, sleeping as if he hadn't, just defied physics and terrified me to my core. I didn't speak the rest of the day. I couldn't. Instead, I packed a go-bag, clothes, my documents, the jar with the thread, food for the pups, a leash for Maple. Just in case. I didn't know where I'd go, only that I couldn't stay there another night. That afternoon, I took Ash to the vet under the guise of a checkup, hoping, somewhere deep down, that they'd notice something, anything abnormal. The vet smiled, gave him a clean bill of health, said he was remarkably alert for his age, and joked that I had a genius on my hands. I didn't laugh. On the drive home, I took a different route, doubling back twice, checking the mirror over and over, but there was no one behind me, no tall figure, no parked car that shouldn't be there. Still, when I got back, the jar was back on my desk, even though I'd hidden it in my sock drawer under a pile of shirts and locked the bedroom door. And this time, there was something else in the jar, a single piece of folded paper, no larger than a gum wrapper, with 5 typed words that made my stomach turn to ice. He remembers what you don't. I sat down slowly, the paper still clenched between my fingers, rereading the words over and over. He remembers what you don't. And something about the phrasing crawled under my skin. Not he knows, not he saw, but remembers, like the past was something shared, something that belonged to both of us. I stared at Ash, now awake and alert in the corner of the room, those impossible eyes fixed on me with that same eerie calm, like he'd been waiting for me to piece it all together. I racked my memory, tried to dig up anything from my childhood, dreams I'd forgotten, people I'd met, anything that might explain why this was happening. And then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years, a dream I used to have as a kid, recurring almost nightly, always the same. I'd be in a hallway, long and narrow, lined with closed doors, and at the very end was a single red thread dangling from a doorknob. I'd reach for it, but I'd always wake up just before touching it. It haunted me for years, then just stopped, until now. I Googled everything I could. Reincarnation, shared memory, ancestral dreams, cursed objects, but none of it fit exactly, and all of it made me feel like I was spiraling. Maple had started pacing again, eyes constantly shifting toward the front door, and the 6 other pups now huddled together away from Ash like they sensed something they couldn't name. I started writing everything down, every dream, every sound, every movement from Ash, as if documenting it might help me stay sane. And then, on the morning of the 6th day, someone knocked. Just once, soft but certain, like they already knew I was on the other side. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there in the hallway, heart racing. As Maple stepped between me and the door, her body tense, hackles raised. The knock came again, and then a voice, low, calm, and female, said, "We know you're in there. It's time." I looked down at Ash, who was sitting calmly by the door now, red thread back around his neck, and I realized what scared me most wasn't that they'd found us. It was that he seemed ready to go. I backed away slowly, pressing my spine against the opposite wall, my hand searching blindly for anything I could use to defend myself, because even though the voice was calm, something in it curled cold around my ribs like smoke from a long dead fire. Maple didn't move, just stood there between the door and Ash, her body taut like a drawn bow, tail stiff, every muscle holding the line. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it made my ears ring, and then I heard footsteps walking away, but not fast, not urgent, just measured, deliberate, like someone who knew they didn't need to rush because they'd already won. I waited a full 10 minutes before unlocking the door and peeking out. The hallway was empty, quiet. And the only thing out of place was a small envelope on the doormat with no name, no seal, just a single red fingerprint pressed into the center. I brought it inside, heart pounding, opened it with shaking hands, and inside was a Polaroid photo, not of Ash, not of Maple, but of me, standing in my kitchen, wearing the same sweatshirt I had on right now. I staggered back, nearly dropping the photo, because I had no memory of it being taken, and there was no camera in my apartment that I hadn't put there. I turned it over, and written on the back in that same neat, typewritten font were the words, "It's not the first time. It won't be the last." I dropped the envelope, backed into the wall, and looked at Ash, who had now crawled up into Maple's side, curling against her like he always had, but her eyes weren't on him. They were on me, wide and glassy, and I realized something was wrong. I rushed over, knelt beside her, and she didn't move, not a flinch, not a blink, just stillness. I pressed my hand to her side, nothing. Maple was gone. 1 second she was breathing, alive, holding the line, and the next she was just not. Ash didn't make a sound, didn't seem scared or confused. He just looked up at me with that impossible calm and blinked, once, slowly, and it hit me with sudden clarity. She hadn't died from fear or illness or exhaustion. She'd done what she came to do. She'd stayed just long enough to deliver him, and make sure I was the one who'd keep him when she couldn't anymore. I buried Maple in the backyard that evening, under the lilac tree that never quite bloomed but still gave shade in the summer, wrapping her in the same blanket I'd first carried her home in. The other 6 puppies watched from the window, yipping softly like they sensed something was leaving them, even if they didn't understand what it was. Ash stayed silent, perched by the kitchen door, eyes locked on the back of my head the entire time, and I don't know why, but I felt the need to speak out. Loud as I shoveled, telling Maple I was sorry, that I didn't know what this was or what I'd gotten into, but I'd try to do right by him, even if I didn't understand how. When it was done, I sat on the grass, hands muddy, and just stared at the dirt until the sun dipped below the fence line and the yard filled with blue shadow. Inside, the air felt too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I fed the puppies, held each one close, then sat on the couch with Ash curled in my lap. The jar with the thread on the table in front of us like a centerpiece to something sacred or cursed or both. Around midnight, I heard it again, soft scratching at the door, the same slow, deliberate rhythm I'd heard once before. I didn't get up this time. I just whispered, "He's not going with you," and waited. The scratching stopped, followed by the faintest tap, like fingertips, not claws, then nothing. The next morning, there was no note, no figure across the street, no camera glitch or mysterious knock, just a quiet I hadn't felt in weeks, a stillness that almost felt like surrender. I kept waiting for something else to happen, for Ash to speak, or change, or disappear. But he didn't. He just grew, a little more each day, still ahead of his littermates. Still watching me with those dark, ageless eyes. The dream stopped, the thread stayed in the jar, and for a while, I started to believe it might be over, that maybe I'd passed some kind of test, and whatever was chasing him had let go. Until this morning, when I opened the front door to get the mail and found a tiny box on the mat, no label, just wrapped in twine, and inside it, a single piece of paper with 3 words typed neatly in the center, "Now it begins." I didn't bring the box inside, just stood there on the doorstep in my slippers, heart pounding like a warning bell, staring down at those 3 words that had the weight of a sentence. Now it begins. I wanted to believe it was a threat, or a bluff, or just some elaborate prank, but the moment I looked back through the open door and saw Ash sitting perfectly still in the hallway, staring not at me but at the box, I knew it wasn't. He didn't bark, didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, his eyes unreadable but electric with something unspoken. I stepped over the box and shut the door behind me, locking both bolts, sliding the chair under the knob for good measure. For the rest of the day, I waited for something to happen. Another knock, another note, another photograph slipped under the door, but nothing came. The only thing that changed was Ash. By evening, he was pacing, not frantic, not scared, just methodical, circling the apartment like he was memorizing its limits. I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, scrolled through old photos, but everything felt suddenly too loud or too quiet. And I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had started bending around him. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did I. We just sat there, facing each other in the dim light of the hallway, the air between us charged with a silence that didn't feel empty, but full of what? I didn't know. And then, just before dawn, he stood, walked slowly to the front door, and sat, tail curled neatly to the side. I followed, heart in my throat, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Are they coming?" He turned his head slightly, eyes meeting mine with that same impossible depth. And if I didn't know better, I'd swear I saw a flicker of sadness there, like he wished it could have gone another way. I reached down, fingers trembling, and gently removed the red thread from the jar. I tied it back around his neck, careful not to pull too tight. And as I did, he leaned into my hand just once, just enough to say yes. I opened the door, and standing there wasn't a person or a thing or a shadow, it was just light, pouring in like a flood, warm and golden and humming with a sound I could feel in my teeth. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The light wasn't blinding, but it was everywhere, not harsh like the sun, not artificial like bulbs, just warm, living, and layered with a low harmonic hum that made my ribs vibrate like someone had tuned the space around me to a new frequency. Ash didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, paused silent on the threshold, and as his body passed into that light, it shimmered, just faintly, like ripples on the surface of water after a stone disappears. I reached out, maybe to stop him, or maybe just to feel it for myself. And the moment my fingers grazed the edge of the light, I remembered, not something recent, not from this life, not a memory with edges and names, but a feeling that unfolded in my chest like a page unburning. I knew him. I had always known him, not as Ash, not as a dog, but as something older, deeper, like a piece of my soul I'd forgotten had once left, only to return wrapped in fur and silence and a red thread to remind me. The light pulsed once, soft and slow. And then Ash turned to look at me, really look, one last time, and in that single glance, I understood what none of the letters or dreams or whispers had been able to say. He didn't come here to be saved. He came here to save me. And then he stepped forward again and was gone, swallowed gently by the light like a sigh fading into song. The doorway darkened, the hum dissolved, and the morning sunlight spilled into my apartment as if nothing had ever been there. I stood still for a long time, hand on the doorknob, heart hollow but light, like something had been lifted out of me that I'd never known was weighing me down. Behind me, the other 6 puppies stirred, still asleep, still unaware. The jar was empty now, the thread gone. The letters stopped coming, the dreams didn't return, and the camera in the hallway started working again without a service call. And in the quiet that followed, I began to live, not afraid, not waiting, just aware that sometimes the universe bends toward you, disguised in small miracles, and you don't recognize the meaning until it's already passed through you. Some dogs are just dogs, and some are messengers.